The auctioneer's chant was the only thing moving faster than the November wind that whipped across the scraped bare farmstead of Old Man Hemlock. It was the fall of 1971, and another family farm was being scattered to the four corners of the county. Frank Miller stood at the back of the crowd, hands shoved deep in the pockets of his canvas work coat, the collar turned up against the bite in the air. He wasn't here for the big iron. He was here for the ghosts, for the small things. A set of wrenches that hadn't been made in 30 years, a well-oiled post-hole digger, the kind of forgotten treasures that kept a man like him running. His own tractor, a 1951 Farmall M, sat gleaming at the edge of the lot, a stark island of faded red in a rising sea of John Deere green. He'd given her a fresh coat of paint the winter before, not to fool anyone into thinking she was new, but out of respect. She was his, bought and paid for by his father's sweat and his own. Every nut, every wire, every gasket was a story he knew by heart. The main event was a John Deere 40-20, barely 3 years old, its green paint still holding a factory shine under the grime. The diesel engine idled with a confident, throaty rumble that was a world away from the simple pop, pop, pop of his Farmall's gasoline engine. Men with checkbooks in their breast pockets crowded around it, their faces a mixture of envy and calculation. That's when he saw Walt Perkins moving through the crowd. Walt owned the John Deere dealership in town, and he moved with the self-assurance of a man who held the keys to the kingdom. He wasn't just selling tractors, he was selling a future of bigger yields, bigger acres, and bigger loans. He had a smile that could talk a man right out of his life savings, and a handshake that felt like the closing of a deal. Walt spotted Frank and changed his course, a predator zeroing in on an outlier. He clapped a heavy hand on Frank's shoulder, his voice booming over the auctioneer's patter. "Miller, figured I'd find you back here with the antiques, looking for some spare parts for that museum piece of yours?" He gestured with his chin toward the Farmall M. A few of the other farmers, men who had recently signed papers on new green machines from Walt, turned and chuckled. Frank felt a familiar heat rise in his neck, but he kept his voice level. "She runs fine, Walt. Just seeing what's here." "Runs fine?" Walt laughed, a loud, dismissive bark. "Frank, that thing was obsolete when your daddy bought it. Look at this." He swept his arm toward the 40-20, now the center of a bidding war. "That's 100 horses of pure American power. Synchro-range transmission, power steering, a cab with a radio for crying out loud. It'll do in a day what that old red relic of yours does in a week." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was still loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I can put you in that tractor today, Frank. A man with your land, 160 acres clear. The bank'll be falling over themselves. 0 down. We can roll the cost of a new planter in there, too. Stop playing in the dirt and start farming for real." The words hung in the cold air, sharp and deliberate. Playing in the dirt. It was an insult wrapped in a sales pitch, a public declaration that Frank Miller was a man stuck in the past, a fool too stubborn to see the gold rush happening right under his feet. Frank slowly pulled his hands from his pockets. They were calloused and stained with the kind of grease that soap could never fully conquer. He looked at Walt's hands, soft and clean, then met his eyes. "She's paid for, Walt," Frank said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of bedrock. "That M doesn't have a banker's name on the title next to mine. She puts the seed in the ground and takes the crop out. That's all I need a tractor to do." Walt's smile tightened. He saw he wasn't making a sale. He was dealing with a different kind of man, and he didn't like it. It was a rejection of his whole world view. "Suit yourself, Miller," he scoffed, turning away. "But don't come crying to me when you're trying to find parts for that thing in a scrap yard. The future's coming, whether you're on board or not." He walked back toward the 4020, leaving Frank in a pocket of silence as the nearby farmers shuffled their feet and avoided his gaze. Frank stayed until the end, picked up an old anvil for $5 and a set of heavy-duty log chains for $10. As he loaded them into the back of his pickup, he watched the man who'd bought the 40.20 sign, a thick stack of papers on the hood of Walt Perkins's car. The farmer looked proud, but also a little pale. He was a landowner, but today he'd just taken on a partner he'd never met, a banker in Des Moines. Driving home, the familiar whine of his Ford F-100's transmission was a comforting sound. He passed fields of corn stubble, black dirt waiting for the frost to set in. He thought about Walt's words. Was he a fool? Was he honoring his father's legacy of thrift and independence, or was he just afraid? Every farmer in the county was borrowing, expanding. They were talking about corn hitting $2 a bushel and staying there forever. Land that was $500 an acre 5 years ago was selling for $1,000 now. Walt was the prophet of this new age, and his gospel was leverage. Frank's philosophy was simpler, etched into him by a father who'd survived the 30s. You don't spend what you don't have. You don't bet the farm because it's the only one you've got. You own your machines. You don't rent them from the bank. It was a lonely creed in 1971. Before we go any further, I need to know where you stand on this. Are you Team Frank, believing a man should only own what he can pay for in cash? Or are you with Walt, thinking you got to use the bank's money to make real money? Let me know what you think, because the answer to that question defined a whole generation of farmers, and it's at the heart of this story. For Frank, the answer was clear, but the price of that conviction was about to get mighty high. The next couple of years were a quiet battle. Frank farmed his 160 acres with the old M and a patchwork of used equipment he kept running with wire, wits, and welding rod. He saw Walt Perkins at the co-op or the diner, and Walt would always give him a pitying smirk, sometimes asking loudly if he'd decided to join the 20th century yet. Frank just nodded and went about his business. He and his wife, Mary, lived simply. They didn't take vacations, didn't buy new furniture. Every spare dollar went into an old coffee can in the pantry, saved for the day a piece of machinery would finally give up the ghost. That day came in the spring of '73, right in the middle of planting. He was on his last 20 acres of corn, the Farmall M pulling the old 4-row John Deere planter. The sun was warm, the soil was perfect, and the steady, rhythmic bark of the C-152 engine was the heartbeat of his world. Then it happened. There was no warning, no sputter or cough, just a single, catastrophic bang that sounded like a 12-gauge going off inside the engine block, followed by the sickening shriek of tortured metal and a complete, sudden silence. A thick plume of blue-white smoke billowed from the breather tube, carrying the acrid smell of burnt oil and shattered hopes. Frank knew what it was before he even killed the ignition. He felt it in the pit of his stomach, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the spring air. He climbed down from the seat, his boots sinking into the soft, tilled earth. Oil was already dripping from a new crack in the side of the block, a black tear running down the faded red paint. He'd thrown a rod. The connecting rod for one of the pistons had snapped, punching a hole clean through the cast-iron wall of the engine block. It was a fatal wound. He stood there for a long time, staring at the dead machine in the middle of his field, the planter boxes still half full of seed corn. The silence was deafening. This was what Walt Perkins had warned him about. This was the price of stubbornness. Getting it back to the workshop was a miserable, day-long affair. He had to walk the 2 miles home, get his pickup, and find a neighbor, one who still talked to him, to pull the dead tractor out of the field with a heavy chain. By the time he had it on the concrete floor of his shop, the sun was setting, casting long shadows that made the broken engine look even more grotesque. Mary brought him out a sandwich and a thermos of coffee. She didn't say much, just put a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was all he needed. He wasn't just fighting for a principle anymore. He was fighting for her, for the life they were building. The next morning, the teardown began. This was where Frank was different from the new breed of farmers who just called the dealer when something broke. His workshop was his sanctuary, a cathedral of old tools and organized parts. He started by draining the oil, which came out thick and glittery with metal shavings. He pulled the hood, the fuel tank, the radiator, laying each piece out in order. He unbolted the valve cover, the head, the oil pan. Each bolt was a fight, rusted tight by 20 years of heat and hard work. He used penetrating oil, a breaker bar with a pipe on the end for leverage, and a whole lot of cuss words. When he finally pulled the head, the devastation was clear. The number 3 piston was gone, disintegrated. The connecting rod, a bent and twisted piece of steel, was jammed into the mangled crankshaft. And there it was, a fist-sized, jagged hole in the cylinder wall. The block was junk. For a moment, he felt a wave of despair. A new tractor wasn't an option. Even a used one from the 60s, like an International 806 or a Deere 4010, would cost thousands he didn't have. His only hope was to find a used engine block from a salvage yard and rebuild it himself. He spent the next day on the phone, the old black rotary phone in the kitchen. He called tractor junkyards in 3 states. Most of them laughed. A block for an M? Son, we crushed those years ago. Finally, a gruff old voice from a yard up in Minnesota said he might have one. Got an old girl sitting out back in the weeds. Engine's probably seized, but the block might be good. $100 if you come pull it yourself. It was a 4-hour drive each way. He left before dawn the next day in his pickup, a greasy set of tools rattling in the back. The salvage yard was a graveyard of rusting iron, a sad final resting place for tractors that had once been the pride of a family. He found the M half sunk in the mud, its tires rotted away. It took him 6 hours of brutal, dirty work in the mud and the rain, fighting rusted bolts and wasp nests, but he got the engine block free. He and the old yard owner used a chain hoist to wrestle the 500-pound chunk of iron into the bed of his truck. The drive home was slow. He felt the weight of that engine block in the straining suspension of his truck and in his soul. As he turned onto his own road, a shiny green and yellow pickup slowed down and pulled over. It was Walt Perkins. Walt got out, leaving his truck idling with the radio playing. He sauntered over, peering into the bed of Frank's Ford. He saw the greasy, rust-streaked engine block. "Having some trouble, Miller?" Walt asked, the smirk playing on his lips. "Just making a few repairs," Frank said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Repairs?" Walt chuckled. "Looks like you're trying to build a tractor from scratch. You know, Frank, I just delivered a brand new 4430 to your neighbor, Jim Peterson. 125 horsepower, sound guard body, air conditioning. He'll have his corn in by tomorrow night. How's your planting coming along?" The question was a deliberate jab, and it hit its mark. Frank's fields were sitting, waiting. Every day that passed was a day of lost yield. "I'll get it done," Frank said through his teeth. "Sure you will," Walt said, patting the fender of Frank's truck condescendingly. "You let me know if you ever get tired of playing mechanic and want to be a farmer again. My offer still stands." He walked back to his air-conditioned truck and drove off, leaving Frank in a cloud of dust and humiliation. The next 2 weeks were a blur of meticulous, exhausting work. He spent hours cleaning the salvage yard block, checking it for cracks with dye penetrant. He honed the cylinders by hand, the rhythmic scrape of the tool the only sound in the shop late at night. He ordered a full rebuild kit, new pistons, rings, bearings, gaskets, paid for with the cash from the coffee can. He ground the valves, measured the crankshaft journals with a micrometer, torqued every bolt to spec. His father's old shop manual open on the bench, its pages stained with the grease of a dozen other jobs. He worked until his hands were numb and his back screamed, fueled by coffee and sheer, bloody-minded determination. Finally, the day came. He hoisted the rebuilt engine back into the frame. He reconnected the radiator, the fuel lines, the wiring. With a prayer, he hit the starter. The engine turned over, coughed, and then roared to life, settling into a steady, healthy idle. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He got his corn planted, but he was nearly 3 weeks late. The community had watched his struggle. They'd seen Walt's new tractors delivering planters to his neighbors. They'd seen Frank's field sit empty while everyone else was finishing up. At the co-op, the talk was all the same. Poor Frank Miller, too stubborn for his own good. His dad was the same way. He was an outcast, a living relic they pitied. He'd won the battle in his workshop, but he felt like he was losing the war. The mid-70s arrived like a fever dream. After the Russians bought up a third of the U.S. grain harvest in '72, commodity prices shot to the moon. Corn, which had hovered around $1.50 a bushel for as long as anyone could remember, suddenly blasted past $3. Soybeans went from $3 to $10. It was like the whole Midwest had hit the lottery. Land that Frank's father had bought for $200 an acre was suddenly being appraised at $2,000. A kind of madness set in, a belief that the good times would not only last, but would keep getting better forever. And at the center of this whirlwind, a king was crowned, Walt Perkins. His John Deere dealership became the epicenter of the boom. Farmers, flush with cash and dizzy with optimism, lined up to trade in their old equipment. Walt wasn't just selling tractors anymore. He was selling status, power, a ticket to the big time. He sold massive 4630s with duals, then the new 8630 four-wheel drive articulated monsters that could plow 100 acres before lunch. He sold combines with air-conditioned cabs and stereo systems that cost more than a whole farm had just a decade earlier. And he sold it all on credit, with the full backing of the banks, who were just as caught up in the frenzy. Debt is an asset, Walt would preach to his customers. You use the bank's money to buy land and iron, and the inflation pays the loan for you. You can't lose. He practiced what he preached. With his dealership profits and an ever-expanding line of credit, Walt started buying land. He bought the 80 acres that bordered Frank to the east. Then he bought the Hemlock farm, the one that had been auctioned off across the road to the north. In 5 years, he went from a town businessman to one of the biggest farm operators in the county, with over 1,000 acres to his name. He bulldozed old fence lines, tore down old barns to make way for massive new machine sheds, and farmed fence row to fence row with a fleet of brand new green equipment that ran day and night during planting and harvest. He drove a new Cadillac Eldorado every year and built a sprawling new ranch house on a hill overlooking his empire. To everyone, Walt Perkins was a visionary, the undisputed winner of the new farm economy. Frank, meanwhile, was seen as the man who missed the boat. The high grain prices were good to him too, but his response was radically different. He didn't see it as a jackpot. He saw it as a chance to get clear. The first good year, he took every extra penny and paid off the last of the small mortgage his father had taken out 20 years prior. He'll never forget the day he walked into the bank and handed the cashier the final payment. The banker, Mr. Harris, a man who had been trying to sell him on expansion loans for years, shook his head in disbelief. "Frank, you're the only man I know doing this," Harris said, stamping the papers. "Everyone else is borrowing more. Jim Peterson just took out a loan to buy that quarter section down the road. Paid $3,000 an acre for it. Can you believe it?" Frank just nodded. "I like the feeling of sleeping at night, I guess." He didn't stop there. He kept farming with the rebuilt Farmall M and his other old equipment. He was making more money than he ever had. But his lifestyle didn't change. He and Mary still drove the old Ford, still grew a big garden, still lived by the seasons. The coffee can in the pantry filled up, then another and another. Finally, in 1978, he found what he was looking for. A farmer a few counties over was retiring and selling off his equipment. Frank drove over and paid cash for a 1972 International Harvester 1066 and a 6-bottom plough. The 1066 was a beast compared to his M. 125 horsepower of pure diesel torque, a closed-center hydraulic system, and a cab to keep the dust out. It was 6 years old, but to Frank it felt brand new. It was his, free and clear. He'd stepped up, but on his own terms, with his own money. To his neighbors, it was just more proof of his foolishness. "Can you believe it?" they'd say at the diner. Frank Miller finally buys a bigger tractor, and he buys a 10-year-old red one. Walt would have put him in a brand new Deere for nothing down. That man is just allergic to making money. The scorn had turned to pity. He was no longer a threat or an oddity. He was just a failure, a man who lacked the vision and the courage to get rich when the getting was good. One evening in the late fall of '79, Frank was finishing up his chisel, ploughing with the 1066. The big international tractor felt powerful under him, the roar of the diesel, a satisfying rumble in the quiet twilight. He looked across the road at Walt Perkins's land. A brand-new John Deere 8640, its 8 massive tires churning, was pulling a 24-foot disc, its halogen lights cutting through the dusk like a spaceship. The sheer scale of it was breathtaking. Walt was farming in a different universe. Later that week, Frank was in the bank depositing a check from the elevator. Mr. Harris, the banker, called him into his office. He looked more stressed than usual. "Just wanted to congratulate you again on being debt-free, Frank," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You're a rare bird." "Things still booming?" Frank asked. Harris's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The loans are booming. The prices, maybe not so much. Corn's dropped 50 cents from its high. But the real problem is the interest rates." He tapped a report on his desk. The prime rate just hit 15%. The new chairman of the Federal Reserve, this fellow Paul Volcker, he's declared war on inflation, says he'll raise rates as high as it takes to break it. Frank felt a cold knot form in his stomach. What does that mean for all these farm loans? "It means," the banker said, lowering his voice, "that all those variable rate operating loans we wrote at 8% last year are about to renew at 16, maybe 17%. The payments are going to double." Frank left the bank and stood on the sidewalk, the cold November air feeling colder than it should. He thought of the farmers he knew, their operations leveraged to the hilt, their futures dependent on low interest rates and high commodity prices. He looked up the street and saw Walt Perkins climbing into his new Cadillac. For the first time, when Frank looked at the man, he didn't feel envy or anger. He felt a profound and unsettling sense of dread. The sound of that big, powerful John Deere engine he'd heard in the field now seemed less like the sound of progress and more like the rumble of a distant, approaching storm. The new decade began not with a roar, but with a quiet, tightening squeeze. By the spring of 1980, the talk at the co-op had changed. The boisterous laughter about record yields and rising land values was gone, replaced by hushed, worried conversations in the corners of the feed store. The price of diesel fuel had doubled, and the fertilizer bill for an acre of corn was suddenly more than the land itself had cost 20 years before. But the real poison was the interest rate. Paul Volcker's war on inflation had become a carpet-bombing campaign on rural America. The prime rate climbed past 20%. Men who had signed 5-year notes at 8% were now facing renewal letters from the bank, quoting 18, 19, 21%. Their payments didn't just go up, they exploded. Frank saw the first real cracks that summer. He was cultivating his soybeans with the old Farmall M, the familiar pop, pop, pop of its engine, a comforting rhythm under the hot July sun. Across the fence, on Jim Peterson's land, a green and yellow giant stood silent. It was the John Deere 4430 that Walt had sold him with such fanfare. Jim was standing beside it, his hands on his hips, staring at the engine compartment. Frank pulled the M to a stop at the end of the row and walked over. "Trouble, Jim?" Jim Peterson looked up, his face slick with sweat and frustration. "She just quit. Not a sputter, just died." I turn the key and all I get is a click. The dash lights up like a Christmas tree with warning buzzers. Frank looked at the complex maze of wiring and hydraulic lines packed into the engine bay. It was a world away from the simple, accessible design of his old tractors. "Check your battery cables?" "First thing I did," Jim sighed. "It ain't simple. I called Walt's dealership. They said it's probably an electrical solenoid in the injection pump. Said they'd have to send their certified mechanic out with the diagnostic kit. $200 just for the service call, plus parts and labor." He kicked the massive rear tire, a gesture of pure impotence. $200 to find out what's wrong. God knows what it'll cost to fix it, and my beans need spraying. Frank didn't know what to say. He knew the part on his M that did the same job was a simple mechanical linkage that cost $12 and could be replaced with a wrench and a screwdriver in 20 minutes. He watched the next day as the dealership's gleaming new service truck pulled into Jim's field. The mechanic, a young kid in a clean green uniform, didn't open a toolbox. He opened a briefcase and plugged a cord into a port under the tractor's dashboard. An hour later, he had it running. Jim told Frank later that it was a faulty sensor. The part itself was $80. The final bill, with the service call and 2 hours of labor, was $457. Jim had to put it on his operating loan at the bank, borrowing money at 20% interest to fix the tractor he was already paying 20% interest on. The cracks in Walt Perkins's empire began to show too, though he tried desperately to hide them. Frank noticed he was driving the same Cadillac for a second year in a row. The big dealership, once bustling, was now quiet. Farmers weren't buying. They were trying to figure out how to pay for what they already had. One afternoon, Frank was at the parts counter, picking up a hydraulic filter for his 1066. He saw Walt in his office, the door slightly ajar, and his voice was sharp, strained. "What do you mean you're putting us on COD?" Walt was saying into the phone. "We've been doing business for 15 years. Times are tight for everyone." "No, I can't clear the full balance right now. Listen to me." The voice on the other end must have hung up, because Walt slammed the receiver down so hard, the bell inside the old phone gave a pathetic little jingle. He sat there, staring at the wall, his face pale and slack. The king looked like he was beginning to feel the weight of his crown. Walt's own farming operation was bleeding him dry. He'd bought his land at the absolute peak of the market, paying $3,000 to $4,000 an acre. Now, with corn prices falling back toward $2 and his interest payments tripling, every acre was a losing proposition. He had to pay 2 full-time hired men to run his fleet of massive, fuel-guzzling machines. Frank, working alone on his paid-for land with his fuel-sipping tractors, was still making a small profit. Walt, with 10 times the land and 100 times the overhead, was hemorrhaging cash. The grand vision, the gospel of leverage he had preached so fervently, was turning into a nightmare. The inflation that was supposed to pay his debts for him had vanished, leaving only the crushing, naked weight of the debt itself. The storm Mr. Harris had warned of was no longer distant. It was here. By 1983, the storm had become a deluge. The farm crisis was no longer a topic for worried whispers. It was a brutal, public reality. The back pages of the county newspaper, once filled with ads for new equipment, were now a grim ledger of forced auctions. Every week, another family name appeared, a family that had farmed the same ground for 100 years, now being sold out on the courthouse steps. The phrase, Chapter 12 bankruptcy, entered the local vocabulary. There was a quiet desperation in the air, a sense of shame and failure that hung over the community like smoke from a slow-burning fire. Land values, the bedrock of every farmer's wealth and borrowing power, collapsed. Ground that had been appraised at $4,000 an acre in 1979 was now lucky to bring $1,000 at auction. The banks, terrified by their own overexposure, began calling in loans. A farmer's balance sheet could be positive one day and $100,000 in the red the next, all because the banker had decided to reevaluate assets. It was a house of cards, and a harsh wind was blowing. Frank and Mary weathered it by living as they always had. They had no debt. Their farm was an island of stability in a sea of chaos. Frank's frugality, once a source of mockery, was now his salvation. The coffee cans in the pantry were still there, full of the cash they had saved during the good years. He didn't feel smart or triumphant, just fortunate and deeply sad for his neighbors. He saw the toll in their faces at the diner, the haunted eyes, the new lines of worry etched around their mouths. These were good men, hard workers who had simply followed the advice of the experts, the bankers and the salesmen. They had believed in the promise of a new era, and the promise had been broken. The day Frank knew it was truly over was the day he saw the auction notice for Perkins Land and Cattle Inc. It was a full-page ad. Over 1,000 acres of prime farmland, a full line of late-model John Deere equipment, and a 4-bedroom executive ranch home. The auctioneer was the same man who had sold off the Hemlock farm over a decade earlier. Walt Perkins, the prophet of the boom, was being consumed by the bust. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a fitting sky for a funeral. The crowd was huge, but quiet. They weren't there with the hungry excitement of a typical farm sale. They were there to witness the fall of a giant, and perhaps to see a reflection of their own fears. The equipment was lined up in perfect gleaming green rows, just as it had been on Walt's sales lot. The massive 8640 four-wheel drive, the 4430s, the huge combines with their grain heads resting on the ground like severed heads. They looked powerful, but everyone there knew they were anchors, dragging a man to the bottom. Frank stood at the back, just as he had all those years ago. He saw Walt standing near the house, away from the crowd. He wasn't the same man. The custom-tailored suit was gone, replaced by a simple work coat. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a defeated slump in his shoulders. He looked older, smaller. His wife stood beside him, her arm linked through his, her face a mask of strained composure. The auction began with the equipment. The prices were heartbreaking. Tractors that Walt had sold for $100,000 just a few years before were now selling for $20,000 or $30,000. The bankers who held the notes stood by with grim faces, watching their collateral evaporate into the cold November air. The farmers who were buying were the ones like Frank, the quiet ones, the debt-free ones, the ones who had cash. They bought the machinery for pennies on the dollar, not with triumph, but with a somber sense of opportunity born from another man's ruin. Finally, the auctioneer moved to the land. It was sold in parcels. The first few pieces went to out-of-state investment groups. Then they came to the 80-acre parcel that bordered Frank's farm to the east. It was a good piece of ground, gently rolling down to the creek. "All right, folks, what am I bid for this prime 80-acre tract?" the auctioneer chanted. The bidding started low, $1,000 an acre. It crept up slowly. Frank listened, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. This was the moment. He had walked this ground with his father as a boy. He knew every dip and swell of it. When the bidding stalled at $1,250 an acre, Frank raised his hand. $1,300, he said, his voice clear and steady. A few heads turned. Frank Miller, bidding on land. The auctioneer's eyes found him. $1,300 from Mr. Miller. Do I hear $1,350? There was a long silence. The other bidders, men who were themselves struggling, shook their heads. They were out. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking like a rifle shot. "For $1,300 an acre to Frank Miller." A murmur went through the crowd. Frank felt 100 pairs of eyes on him, but he wasn't looking at them. He was looking at Walt Perkins. Their eyes met across the yard. There was no triumph in Frank's gaze, and no anger in Walt's. There was only a quiet, devastating understanding of how far they had both come. An hour later, after the final parcel had been sold, and the crowd began to disperse, Frank walked over to the makeshift clerk's table and wrote a check for the full amount of the land purchase, drawing from the savings he and Mary had so carefully accumulated. He saw Walt nearby, talking to one of the bankers, his face ashen. When the banker walked away, Frank approached him. "Walt," he said quietly. Walt turned, his eyes hollow. "Miller, come to enjoy the show?" The words were bitter, but they lacked their old bite. "No," Frank said. "I came to buy that 80 acres. It's good land." Walt gave a short, harsh laugh. "Yeah, it is. I paid $4,000 an acre for it. You got it for a steal. The price of things changes," Frank said, not unkindly. "I remember a time you told me I was playing in the dirt, that I wasn't a real farmer." Walt looked down at his own hands, the soft hands of a salesman, now calloused from the desperate physical work he'd been trying to do to save his own farm. "I said a lot of things back then, Frank. Turns out you were the one farming for real all along. You and your daddy. You knew something the rest of us forgot." He looked out over the fields that were no longer his. "We were just playing with the bank's money. It was never really ours." Frank thought of the humiliation he'd felt that day in his pickup, the broken engine block in the back, Walt mocking him from his new truck. All the anger he'd held on to for years was gone, replaced by a simple, profound sorrow. This wasn't a victory. It was a tragedy. "What will you do now, Walt?" "I don't know," Walt whispered. "The bank took everything. The house, the dealership, everything. We'll have to move into town. Maybe I can get a job selling cars." He looked at Frank, a flicker of the old salesman in his eyes. But it was desperate now. "You'll need someone to work that new ground for you. I know that land better than anyone." Frank considered it for a long moment. He could have savored the moment, turned the knife. But that wasn't his way. The offers appreciated Walt. but I think I can handle it. If you need some help moving your things out of the house, though, you give me a call. I've got a strong back and an old pickup." He offered his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Walt took it. The handshake wasn't a deal being closed. It was a quiet acknowledgement of a wheel that had come full circle. As Frank walked back to his truck, he felt the weight of the day, the weight of the years. He had been vindicated, but it tasted like ashes. In the years that followed, the landscape of the county changed. The names on the mailboxes were different. Some farms were bought by corporations, others were consolidated by the few survivors. Frank Miller was one of them. 2 years after Walt's auction, the old Hemlock place came up for sale again, this time from a bankrupt insurance company that had foreclosed on it. Frank bought that too. He now owned 320 contiguous acres, his original homestead in the middle, a solid, debt-free block of the richest soil in Iowa. His reputation in the community had transformed. He was no longer the stubborn eccentric. He was the wise man, the one who had navigated the storm. Younger farmers, the ones just starting out, would stop by his workshop, not to ask about loans, but to ask how to set the timing on an old distributor, or how to weld a cracked plow frame. He'd wipe the grease from his hands and show them, patiently explaining the mechanics of the older machines he knew so well. He never preached about the evils of debt. He didn't have to. The landscape of abandoned farmhouses was sermon enough. He simply shared his knowledge, the practical wisdom of self-sufficiency. One warm Saturday in the fall of 1989, Frank was in his workshop, a place that felt more like home than the house did sometimes. He was working on the old Farmall M. He'd kept her all these years, using her for light-duty chores. Now he was giving her a full cosmetic restoration, stripping the old paint, sanding the tinwork smooth, preparing her for a new coat of Harvester red. His grandson, a boy of 10 named Michael, was with him, carefully cleaning spark plugs with a wire brush. "Grandpa," the boy asked, "why do we keep this old tractor? The big red one is way stronger." He meant the 1066. Frank stopped sanding and looked at the boy. He knelt down so they were eye to eye. "This tractor is different, Mike. This one taught me the most important lesson there is." "What's that?" "It's about what it means to truly own something," Frank said, tapping a fender. "When you buy something with borrowed money, it's not really yours. It belongs to the bank. You're just renting it. And the banker can decide to take it back anytime he wants. But this old girl—" He ran his hand over the smooth, bare metal. "My father paid for her with 3 good years of corn. I rebuilt her with money I'd saved in a coffee can. Every nut and bolt on her is ours. No one can ever take her away. That's a powerful feeling, son. It's called freedom." He looked out the open workshop door, across his fields of corn, the stalks dry and golden, waiting for the harvest. He could see the roof of the old Hemlock barn in the distance, and the trees that lined the creek on the land that had once been Walt's. It was all his, not because he was smarter or better, but because he had held fast to a simple, old-fashioned idea. He had bet on himself, on his own hands, and on the rich black soil under his feet. He stood up and handed the boy a small wrench. "Now let's get this valve cover torqued down. There's always work to be done." The boy smiled and went to work, and Frank watched him, feeling a deep and abiding peace. The future was uncertain, as it always was. But he had built something that would last. He had honored his father's legacy, and now he was passing it on. The quiet hum of the workshop, the smell of grease and old iron, the steady presence of the boy beside him. This was his harvest, the truest yield a man could ever hope for.